Hello everyone, we are from Group 2 and today in this video we're going to explain a bit of the book Making Globalization Work by Joseph Stiglitz. My name itself is Joseph Lumoindong and my colleagues is Juan, Luthfi, Alessandro, and Kevin. Okay, so for the book summary, this book examines and highlights the negative and positive impacts of globalization through different perspectives. And through many cases, Joseph Stiglitz creatively points out also the weakness of globalization by criticizing the international organization, such as International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So for the chapter 1, Joseph Stiglitz concisely highlights the effects of globalization and weakness. It is true that in many cases, globalization gave positive impacts like opening up trades, but through certain times, not all have the benefit from the globalization, especially the developing countries. And the key impacts of the weakness consist of unfair trades, inequality of trades, and unfair decision making. And it leads to globalization reforming, such as pervasiveness of poverty. It is mentioned that IMF should focus on more assistance and fairer trade regime, not by creating higher unemployment rate and more poverty. Second one is need for foreign assistance and debt reliefs. This creatively highlights that World Organization must think of a way to assist low-income countries in overcoming their debt obligation. Third one is fair trade. For example, like in certain cases, the poorest countries had actually been made worse off by the last trade agreements, and in future trade agreements, it should lead to growth for both sides of the parties. Fourth one is limitation of liberalization. Trade liberalization should produce growth by ensuring both sides have equal liberalization and reduce corruption. The fifth one is the protection of environment. And the last one is acknowledgement of flawed system in global governance. Because in the book, the Joseph Stiglitz highlights that World Organization is a bit of corrupt. For example, Europe and US deal for IMF. US deals that Europe can be the head, and for the World Banks, US can be the head and Europe can be the second parties. Next slide is roles of global institution in global economy, that global institution must change to make globalization work and equal to more people, and decision making should be leveled for all sorts of situation and cannot be the same for one parties or just like for the developed countries. The book highlights that should reduce the effect of monopoly and oligopolies in developing countries, ensuring a widely shared benefit, and government should engage in protecting the poor and promoting equal growth and benefit to all. Next slide.
The next slide is making trade fair. A fair agreement would accept that developing countries should be treated differently compared to developed countries. Richer countries should unconditionally open their markets to poor countries without demanding favors or concessions. Stiglitz believed that poor countries should not have to do the same for richer countries. They are already victimized by the vast subsidies paid by developed nations to their own industries, so true competition becomes impossible. Next. The next is patent, profit, and people. The intellectual property is actually counterintuitive to free trade. Free trade is intended to liberalize the movement of goods and service across borders, whereas intellectual property laws actually prohibit such movement by legally limiting how quickly ideas and inventions can spread. An invention may not reach a developing country because the patent law in the country of origin prevents it from being produced at a reasonable price, even in instances where the invention might save lives. Next.
Okay, so for the chapter 5 of this book, Joseph talked about the lifting the resource curse. So resource curse is a phenomenon where countries with great natural resources perform badly in the world markets. So this situation usually happens in the high resource developing countries because the unstable politics and the lack of strong regulations it were the main drive forces for this phenomenon to happen. And so it creates the perfect environment for the unhealthy inner competition within one country to control the natural resources for personal benefits. And good news to hear that this curse is not inevitable. There are some ways to tackle this. The first one being transparency in the government. The second one is reduce the opportunities for violence. The third one is setting standards for the quality of the resource. The fourth one is the producer must be paid for the value of the worth. And then the fifth one is international organization must set norms to ensure the countries are treated well. Next. So on the next chapter, Joseph talked about saving the planet. Joseph discussed about the environmental issues that caused by the economics. Because as the competition becomes tighter, we often neglect the environmental side. So we need to focus more on the uh, consequences that the economics are doing for the future. Joseph talked about the tragedy of the common. It is where something is very commonly used that we often forget about the consequences and how might it harm the future. And the solutions that Joseph offers, the first one is privatization that manage the resource, and then the second one is the government itself to manage the resource. So the best way to confront the global warming is reducing emission. Next.
Moving on to the chapter 7 with the title of Making Globalization Work. So one of the things that makes this chapter interesting is how Stiglitz can provide readers with broad insight about the positive and negative sides of MNCs. And also there is a statement about MNCs will legalize all means to achieve their goals. Knowing that making money is their top priority, so obviously bribery is a common thing for them. And also the other point is those corporations will try to create a doctrine that aims to justify what should not be true. A simple example is a food company that encourages children to eat a lot of sweets, which is not good for their dental health. And also in the chapter, Stiglitz has stated that globalization is not a matter of a good or a bad thing, but rather how it can be reshaped so that it can function properly again. So to ensure that MNCs act responsibly and contribute to the development of host country, he calls for a tighter regulatory framework. And also the last point is Stiglitz focus on the necessity for a balanced response to MNCs is one of the main points of this chapter. So overall, chapter 7 of Making Globalization Work is able to provide readers with a broader view of globalization. Stiglitz's arguments are well supported by evidence and offer a valuable contribution to the ongoing debate about the role of MNCs in development. Next slide, please. The next one is the chapter 8 with the title of The Burden of Debt. So one of the interesting points about this chapter is Stiglitz's point of view about this situation. He explained that the default on debt is not solely the fault of the borrowing country, but also the fault of the lending country. And also there is a statement about all the IMF can do is instill fear of bankruptcy. Knowing that there is no court that can force a sovereign state to pay debt, and usually there are no assets that can be confiscated. So without the feeling of fear, the loan will not be repaid. And also he contends that a large portion of the debts were accrued by the dishonest leaders who abused the borrowed money. So at the end of the day, the result in over borrowing was one of the things that put a nation into crisis. The other point is that he also trying to argue that typical strategy of the IMF, which entails enforcing austerity measures and demanding debt repayment, has frequently made matter worse by causing even more economic suffer in those countries. And lastly, Stiglitz suggests a number of different ways to deal with debt, including debt relief, increased spending on infrastructure, and so on. And all those things will be explained in more detail in this chapter. So overall, for this chapter, it provides a very thought-provoking and comprehensive perspective of an essential topic that many developing countries are currently grappling with, which is the debt default issue. Next slide, please.
Moving on to chapter 9, Joseph tells why reform is necessary is because the high cost of reserve to developing countries is negatively impacting the global economy. These countries are forced to accumulate large amounts of reserve in order to protect themselves against external shock, such as financial crisis or sudden capital outflows. However, by reforming the global reserve system can have many benefits, including more diversified and balanced reserve system that better reflect the global economy. This can reduce the risk of global financial instability and promote a more stable and prosperous global economy. It can also provide developing countries with more opportunities to invest in productive activities and promote sustainable economic growth. Next. In chapter 10, Joseph talk about democratizing globalizations. First one is fair and equitable trade policies. To democratize globalization, we need to promote fair and equitable trade policies. This means ensuring that all countries have access to markets, technology, and capital on a equal footing. It also means ensuring that workers are paid fair wages and that environmental standards are upheld. Trade policies that prioritize the interests of most powerful countries and corporations can exacerbate inequality and harm the environment. Next. Another way to democratize globalization is by investing in human capital. This means equipping people with the skills they need to succeed in the global economy. Education and training programs can lead to higher paying jobs and more opportunities for economic mobility. By investing in human capital, we can create a more skilled and productive workforce that is better equipped to compete in the global economy. Additionally, investments in healthcare and social safety nets can help protect vulnerable members of society and promote more equitable economic growth. Next. Globalization has been criticized for its lack of democratic accountability and transparency. The dominance of wealthy countries and corporations in globalization institution has led to a democratic deficit. To address this issue, there is a need for a global mindset and identity that depoliticize decision-making, and reforms such as changes to international institutions, voting structures, representation, transparency, openness, participation, accountability, and judicial procedures are necessary to reduce the democratic deficit in globalization. Next. Thank you, and that's all from us about the book from Joseph.